We're broke. The Fed is raising rates. And these idiots just voted to spend even more money on Obamacare, and we can't even afford the money we're already spending. So it's never going to happen. So depositors lose their money, companies go out of business, investors get wiped out, jobs get destroyed. It's going to be a real mess in the end. That's why they're waiting so long and kicking the can down the road for as many years as they have, because the consequences are so horrible.
Welcome back, rich followers. We hope this video inspires you to get started on your dream. So please watch until the end. And if you are new here, consider subscribing so that you won't miss other educational videos like this. Let's get started. Peter discusses the budget deficit and some of the issues he currently sees.
The Biden administration is going to have to dramatically reduce government spending. Not just reduce the rate of increase, but actually spend less than they did in the past, and actually spend a lot less. The budget deficit is projected to be $2.5 trillion. Now, it's probably going to be over $3 trillion if they're projecting 2.5. But how are they going to sell $2.5 trillion worth of treasuries when the Federal Reserve is also selling hundreds of billions worth of treasuries during the same year? They can't do it. So the federal government is going to have to dramatically cut spending so that they don't have to borrow so much money, or they have to have a massive tax hike on the middle class right now, effective immediately, maybe double income taxes on the middle class, which, clearly they're not going to do. They're not going to cut spending either, because they'd have to cut Social Security, Medicare, all the entitlements. They're just expanding Obamacare. We're broke. The Fed is raising rates. And these idiots just voted to spend even more money on Obamacare, and we can't even afford the money we're already spending. So it's never going to happen. They're just going to keep on printing until they destroy the value of the dollar completely. And as I said, prices are going through the roof. They have just started. They've only just started going up, and they're going much higher.
Peter then discusses how he thinks this economic situation will ultimately end.
Well, it ends, I think, in an inflationary depression. It could end in hyperinflation, where the money has no value whatsoever, and you can't buy anything. No matter how many millions you have, there's nothing that you could buy because no one will sell you something. But if we're going to stop that from happening, then we're going to have to suffer a severe collapse, a financial crisis far greater than anything that we had in 2008. And nobody gets a bailout from anything. No banks get bailed out. They have to fail. And in fact, when they fail, the depositors are going to lose their money, because there's no FDIC money either, because that would have had to come from the Fed. So depositors lose their money, companies go out of business, investors get wiped out, jobs get destroyed. It's going to be a real mess in the end. That's why they're waiting so long and kicking the can down the road for as many years as they have, because the consequences are so horrible, nobody wants to face them. But every time we kick that can down the road, we make those horrible consequences much worse. So since we've been doing it for so long, you can only imagine just how horrific things are going to be in order to avoid hyperinflation, which would be even more catastrophic.
Peter then explains what he would do if he was the president.
If somehow I could become the president of the United States, there's a lot of things I would do. But in the short run, we would have to still go through some pain. There is no quick fix. But what I would do is enable the economy to fix itself over the long run. Because the problem with the economy is government and the Federal Reserve. We need a free market economy, not a government-planned economy. We need the government to dramatically reduce its size and its cost so we can return those resources to the private sector. We need to dramatically deregulate the economy so that the free market can regulate it, not a bunch of bureaucrats. And we need to return to sound money, not money that could just be created out of thin air. I'd like to get rid of the income tax, the federal income tax, the corporate income tax, Social Security tax, make government much smaller. And I think the only thing the federal government should do is national defense, and it still spends too much money on defense. I think the rest of it should be covered by the states, although most of it shouldn't be covered at all. It should be taken care of in the free market. America could be a very prosperous nation again if we repeat what made us so rich in the first place. But right now we're broke. We just don't know it yet. We're living off of borrowed money. We are the world's biggest debtor nation. We owe more money than all the other nations combined. We're running enormous trade deficits with every nation on the face of the earth. So our economy is completely incapable of producing the goods that we consume. We borrow from the rest of the world because we don't have our own savings. We're basically being supported by the rest of the world. The world has to bear the cost of subsidizing the U.S. economy. And that's going to come to an end And if we're going to stand on our own 2 feet, if we're going to be productive again, then we're going to have to return to the limited government, maximum economic freedom type economy that we had in the past.
Peter then explains that the dollar may no longer be the world's reserve currency, and what that means for regular people.
Yeah, first of all, I look at gold as money, as a store of value, not as an investment per se, like you invest in stocks or real estate. You hold on to gold to preserve value because it doesn't throw off a return like stocks or real estate do. People don't really understand the degree to which the American economy is dependent on the dollar and its role as the reserve currency. You've often heard the U.S. economy described as a service sector economy. We're all about services. Where do we get all the stuff then? Because we certainly consume a lot of stuff. Americans are, incredible shoppers. But if we have a service sector economy, where's all this stuff coming from that we're buying? Well, it's coming from China and other countries. How do we pay for it? We don't. We just print money. You see, under a normal economy, if we didn't have the reserve currency, we would either have to produce stuff for ourselves or produce stuff for our trading partners to trade with them for the stuff they produce. But we don't have to produce anything. We just print money. And the rest of the world takes the money we print for the stuff they make. And so we have a much higher standard of living because we get to consume all this stuff that we didn't have to produce. So we didn't really pay for it. But when the dollar loses its status, then the rest of the world isn't going to want dollars anymore. They're going to want stuff. And so if we want their stuff, we're going to have to make some stuff of our own to give them. And we can't do it because we don't have the factories. We don't have the savings to create the factories. We don't have the supply chains. We don't have the skilled labor. We don't have anything that a manufacturing economy needs because we're no longer a manufacturing economy. We manufacture a little, but not nearly enough to satisfy our demand. So what would have to happen if the dollar was no longer the reserve currency is American spending would implode. Consumption would collapse because we'd have nothing to buy. And so our entire GDP would implode. We'd have a massive recession because Americans wouldn't be buying anything because we couldn't afford anything. And all the shelves would be empty because foreigners wouldn't be sending us the stuff that they produce. And we don't have the capacity to produce it for ourselves. The only question is when? Because the only way to avoid that would be for the US government to act fiscally responsible. But that's never going to happen. In fact, as long as the dollar is the reserve currency, we have no incentive to be fiscally responsible. So that's the problem here. We're going to keep on doing this until there's a crash, because the only thing that will stop it is a crash. Because we won't voluntarily face the music because it's so politically damaging to the people in power to do that. And I also think that a lot of people in the US, including at the Fed, just take for granted the dollar's reserve currency status. I mean, they don't think that we could ever jeopardize it, that no matter how much money we print, no matter how much our deficits are, the rest of the world is just going to go along for the ride. And I think they believe that because they've gone along so far. And we've gotten away with it this long, and so the belief is we'll get away with it indefinitely. And I think that hubris is going to have a big price because that's not going to be the case. And I also think that the Fed and the US government have underestimated the degree to which that reserve currency status is integral to the entire bubble economy that we have, our whole service sector economy. That's the linchpin. You pull that out and everything implodes.
Peter then explains how the US became a country that made things on its own to a primary importer.
It was big government. It was taxes and regulations that made the US uncompetitive relative to the rest of the world. And then it was going off the gold standard and going on a dollar standard where once the dollar was the reserve currency, the rest of the world needed dollars. And how did they get dollars? They sold stuff to Americans. And so we basically outsourced our entire economy. And in the short run, we benefited because the cost of production was lower overseas than it was in the US, especially because American companies had to deal with high regulations, high taxes, labor unions, all sorts of other things that ran up the cost of production that foreigners didn't have. And of course, a lot of the regulation, the labor laws, the environmental laws, these other countries didn't have to deal with that. And so they didn't have to bake the cost of complying with those regulations into their price of their goods. And the wages were already, much lower in the other countries. So Americans got a good deal. We traded our jobs for stuff. And we did that for decades. But we can't do it anymore because we now have so much debt, and wages around the world have increased to the point where there's not a big arbitrage left anymore between labor costs outside the US and labor costs inside the United States. And foreigners don't want to play this game anymore. They have too many dollars.
If you found value in this video, we would like to give you another video for you to enjoy next. Please like this video and share it with your friends on social media. Don't forget to subscribe if you are new here, so you won't miss another one of our videos. The more you learn, the more you earn.